Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thanks very much for coming along to this seminar. So today we'll be hearing from Dr. Rob Mahar. So Rob is a biostatistician at the University of Melbourne and at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. So he's based in Melbourne, but he's appointed in Melbourne, but he's actually based in Brisbane. So that's why we've signed him up as a visiting fellow here at QUT, because of a few joint research interests between Rob and a couple of academics here. So the idea is that we'll start working together on projects and write some grants together and things like that. As you'll see, Rob is broadly interested in the design analysis of Bayesian clinical trials. So if that's your interest, then please feel free to reach out to Rob for a chat. I'm sure he'd be happy to. In terms of the seminar today, as you can see, Rob will be talking about making smart decisions in prophylaxis and treatment studies. So I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thanks, James. Let's get this. So yeah, James just gave a background on where I'm from and who I am. I did a PhD in biostatistics I finished in 2018. That was focused on Bayesian modelling of infant lung function waveforms, which is a bit left field. Since then, I've been a postdoctoral research fellow, like James said, at the University of Melbourne and MTRI, and I'm what I would call an embedded statistician on quite a few Bayesian adaptive clinical trials. So by embedded statistician, I mean we actually work much more iteratively in the ongoing design and analysis of these trials than one would usually do in a traditionally designed and analysed clinical trial. So my main research interests are developing Bayesian methods for what's called SMART, a SMART trial design. I'll get to that, platform trial designs. And I came here in January 2022. Escaping COVID lockdowns and seeking warmer weather with my family. So I'm at these two institutions, and they're not the only things that we have support for biostatistics in Victoria. We have the Victorian Centre for Biostatistics that involves these three institutions, so including Monash University, and that's all of the academic biostatisticians at those institutes are involved in Vic Biostat, and that's there to support doctoral and postdoctoral level biostatisticians in their career phase. Initially, it was funded by an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence grant, and I think that was in 2011, but it's still going. And I'm also involved in the Australian Trials Methodology Research Network. So that's in many ways a continuation of the Vic Biostat network, but with a national focus and a much greater focus, methodological focus on trials. So enough about me, I guess. What I'm going to be talking about today is, I guess I'll cover what is a SMART. The title I gave to this talk was a little bit vague, but, and not very statistical at all. I'll give the motivating clinical example for the methodology that I'll present. I'll talk about dynamic treatment regimens and dynamic programming, and then the problem that comes up in them, which is related to these, what we call intermediate binary endpoints. I propose a solution that's a decision-theoretic solution, and then an application of this new method to the design of an adaptive clinical trial. And we'll look at a simulation study of that application. So a SMART, as you can see, it stands for sequential multiple assignment randomised trial. So that's a pretty broad and again another vague definition, but all it really means is that it's a trial where patients are randomised to a treatment, and then they have an outcome of that treatment observed. And based on that outcome, they're then re-randomised and observed again, and possibly re-randomised again. So it's not usual to see this in clinical trial design, the re-randomisation. It's important. It's an important design because it can capture the delayed effects of treatment or where there's treatment interactions over time. It can be attractive to patients. So patients where they're randomised to a treatment and that treatment fails, these smarts often then re-randomise them to an experimental treatment. So patients want to stay on the trial. And they're the best way we know of to collect data to evaluate what's known as a dynamic treatment regimen, which I'll come to in good time. So the motivating clinical example was a smart design that cancer researchers at Peter Mac were interested in developing at the start of the COVID pandemic. C-SMART, short for COVID Prevention and Treatment in Cancer. They really liked the idea that they could fit a SMART acronym in the name of their trial, so they were very excited. Basically what the trial does is it randomises cancer patients who are immunocompromised to a prophylactic treatment to try and stop them getting cancer. And if they go on to get cancer, to stop them getting COVID, if they go on to get COVID, then they randomise to an active treatment. So it's best described with this sort of branching tree diagram. You can see patients enter the trial at the left, and they're randomised in equal proportions to either placebo or prophylaxis. If a patient doesn't develop COVID within 3 months in this case, then they exit the trial. If they do develop COVID within that 3 months, then they're also they're re-randomised in equal proportions to either a placebo or a treatment, and then they're followed up for I think it was a month with the endpoint of all-cause mortality, or I just used death in this case. So we can formalize the data structure a bit more. So what we have is this flow of data where patients randomized to a treatment, which we denote with a capital A here, and then followed until they have an outcome, and then they're re-randomized to that treatment, and then followed until they have another outcome. So we have these intermediate endpoints between following each treatment in sequence. At this point, I'm just going to talk about outcomes, the continuous outcomes, just because it's a bit easier to start off like that. And we'll also use this shorthand H for history that summarises all of the history at the point of being assigned a treatment. So in the first stage, in our context, there's obviously no history. In the second stage, we have a history of the first treatment and the treatment received in the first stage and the outcome in the first stage. And then we can define these decision mappings. So we have decisions at each stage that depend on the history at each stage and how they map to a certain treatment. So what we want to be doing is trying to optimize these decision mappings. So in a SMART, when we're actually collecting the data, these decisions are randomized because we're trying to obviously mitigate confounding. But the main aim, once we've collected the data from a SMART, is to try and optimize those treatments for future patients. So we can just substitute in our notation if you're really interested, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Our decision, where our decision points are and where our treatments and outcomes are. So I've talked about dynamic treatment regimens. What are they? The best definition I can give is that it's just an algorithm of how to initiate or to allocate or adjust, so change the dose of a treatment based on time-varying clinical history. And I'll show an example of what that means. So here we can see the colours, green and red, represent two competing dynamic treatment regimens, two possible dynamic treatment regimens. They're known as embedded dynamic treatment regimens, where the algorithm is saying, in the green case, give placebo, and then if they get COVID, give placebo again. In the red case, it's the similar sort of thing, a little different, give prophylaxis. If they get COVID, give placebo. And we can have different dynamic treatment regimens. None of these are necessarily optimal, and so what we want to do is find what is optimal. So what do we mean by optimal dynamic treatment regimen? It's just one that's superior to all others under consideration, and that's with respect to some summary of utility. So that's a pretty general definition. We can have a marginally optimal dynamic treatment regimen or a conditionally optimal one, and by that I mean a marginally optimal one will look at the value of that green regimen, for example, over the course of the regimen, and then a conditionally optimal regimen will be one that's optimal for individual patients. So it will identify the optimal conditional decision rules, so that even if you get stuck in a marginally suboptimal dynamic treatment regimen, you can still identify optimal decision rules within that. Dynamic treatment regimens can be optimized sometimes with observational data. I say sometimes because we did a review of observational studies that tried to apply dynamic treatment regimens. Not many do, and there's various reasons, causal reasons that it's really not possible in a lot of circumstances. So if we were talking about optimizing these decision rules, one sort of intuitive but wrong way of approaching it would be to look at things all at once, or to look at stage-specific all-at-once models. So we might develop a linear model of the outcome with treatment at stage 1, and then in the second stage we have a model of the outcome in stage 2 with respect to all of the possible histories at stage 2. And then we might define some rules that we think to be optimal, to be the treatment in stage 1 that maximises the first stage treatment, and then the treatment in the second stage that maximises the second stage treatment. But this sort of approach completely ignores the delayed effects of treatment from stage 1 and stage 2 into stage 2. So one approach to this problem is to use dynamic programming. So to split the regimen into its component stages and to use backward induction. So to work from the second stage back to the first stage. So we're linking these later stage rewards with early stage actions, or linking later stage outcomes with early stage treatments. What's known as Q-learning is fairly popular in the literature because it's relatively easy to implement. It really just involves nested linear models. There are quite a few other approaches in the dynamic treatment regimen literature that are much more complicated, particularly if you go down the G methods path, so where you start looking at G estimation and things like that, and even more complicated if you're working with observational data. So Q-learning is, it's often said to be this non-Markovian approximate dynamic programming technique. So by dynamic programming, it has this backward induction step. It's approximate because we're using statistical models, and it's non-Markovian because it goes beyond the immediate state and action space. So what does it look like? So the optimal second stage decision is actually, it's what we said it was before, and that all-at-once optimization. We use this Q notation just to make things a bit simpler because it gets complicated when in more sort of complex presentations. But the Q function is just the conditional expectation of the second stage outcome, and that's conditional on the patient history and the treatment received. And so that's okay to use that entire linear model there. We just optimize, we just choose the treatment that maximizes that expected conditional expectation as our second stage optimal decision. And then in the first stage optimal decision, we do a similar thing. We have our Q function of history and treatment, and that's the expectation of the first stage outcome plus this nested expectation, which is just the conditional maximum in the second stage. So this is commonly called in the literature a pseudo outcome. So it's this average, the average best outcome for a patient who has the history at this point. So you can think of this first stage optimal decision as making the best decision, assuming that all subsequent decisions are optimal. So there's a problem. I mean, I've been talking about expectations and continuous outcomes here, but in our C-SMART study, we're actually interested in binary endpoints because we had, a binary endpoint of mortality. Binary endpoint of mortality in the second stage, and an endpoint of COVID infection in the first prophylaxis stage. And so there's not only a problem, which I'll go on to show why it's a problem because they're intermediate and binary, but they're also distinct. So they're actually different, they have different sort of qualitative characteristics. So the problem is that, like I just showed before, we can have this first stage optimal decision with a continuous outcome. And it's this nice nested expectation of an expectation, and that makes sense. But once we start thinking about binary endpoints, we end up with this strange scenario where we can come up with the optimal second stage decision, and that's maximizing the probability of survival. But then we have that nested within another probability statement. So it's this well, not the maximum, this nested term is ill-defined because it's this, we've got this probability of an event plus some maximized probability, which is, you know, a continuous or ratio valued outcome. So I hope that's clear why that causes a problem. And I'll take silence to mean it's crystal clear. So my approach is to push this backward induction step out of the modeling step to a utility function. And this is how I do it. So the first step is to obviously assign utilities to each of the outcomes. And so in this case, I've used a fairly trivial sort of preference set. So I've said that basically any good outcome is assigned a 1, any bad outcome is assigned a 0. So, so if you exit the trial with no COVID, that has a utility of 1. If you exit the trial alive in any way, that has a utility of 1. And if you die on the trial, 0 utility. And then we can formulate our utility function for the second stage treatment outcome. So we have our utilities in the boxes here. So a utility of 1 being that for survival, weighted by the probability of not dying, plus the utility of death, 0, weighted by the probability of dying, where the probability of death here is, again, conditional on history, patient history and treatment. So we can take that utility function and we can compute the posterior expected utility and then choose the treatment that maximizes posterior expected utility. So it's not that different from what we were doing in the second stage. With the sort of classical implementation of Q-learning. And then we have to put together a utility function for the prophylaxis outcome. So it's similar to in what we have in the second stage. We have the utility of 1, utility of not having COVID at all, weighted by the probability of not having COVID. And the difference here is that we include the maximum expected posterior utility as being the outcome for having COVID, because once you have COVID, you either live or die. And so we have a value here of the utility, assuming that you make the best decision in the next stage, and that's weighted by the probability of developing COVID. And we just do like we did before. We can compute the posterior expected utility and optimize as we did before. So I really like this approach because it's pretty straightforward. It solves this problem. This problem's been talked about in the literature for about 10 years, that Q-learning works well with time to event outcomes and continuous, intermediate endpoints that are either time to event or continuous. But with binary endpoints, it fails for the reasons that I showed before with that strange probability statement. And it's nice because it works. Here we just assign this binary utility to death, survival, COVID, no COVID. And it has a similar sort of interpretation using this utility function when we're coming up with these optimal decision rules. They're just seeking to maximize survival probabilities, really. So it's not a lot of the pushback I get when I propose using a decision-theoretic sort of clinical trial model is that it's really hard to assign utilities because they're so subjective. But in this case, even these trivial utilities have the same sort of interpretability as a classical statistical model, like a logistic regression. But it's also great because you can use it for any set of utilities, so not necessarily the 0-1 binary utilities. So because not having COVID at all might be vastly more preferable than having COVID and being alive for obvious reasons, you might choose to weight that utility much more heavily than surviving with COVID. So onto the sort of application of this to adaptive trial design. This was all motivated, I guess, because the C-SMART trial was an adaptive trial, and we couldn't figure out how to set up the adaptations so that they respected all of these delayed effects without developing a new method. I'll talk about what an adaptive clinical trial is. I'm used to talking to biostatisticians only, so if anyone has any questions, please jump in and ask.
Can you explain what prophylaxis is?
Prophylaxis is like a preventative treatment.
For COVID?
For COVID, yeah. So in that case, I think it was intranasal interferon. So people would get a little squirt sort of nose spray, and it had a kind of, I forget what interferon is, it's antiviral or something, and they'd squirt that in their nose every day for 30 days or something. And that was supposed to, well, hypothesize to reduce the chances of the patient getting COVID. So prophylaxis is just a funny, fancy word, I guess, for a preventative measure. Yeah. So in clinical trials, randomised clinical trials, we randomise patients to treatment. I won't go into the reasons why that's a really good idea, other than it takes the treatment allocation, the responsibility for treatment allocation away from the clinicians, because they're shown to be remarkably bad at doing that in experimental settings. In a non-adaptive trial, I've said non-adaptive SMART, but in any non-adaptive trial, simple randomisation or equal randomisation is just the probability that you receive a treatment is proportional to the number of treatments that are under consideration. So here it's just the probability statement. Probability of treatment in the SMART, conditional on whatever history, is 1/2 here because we're only considering 2 treatments. But the problem with this sort of simple randomisation is that it ignores accumulating evidence. When you run a clinical trial, you in a traditional setting, you design the trial, you do a power calculation, which gives you a sample size, and the trialists go off, collect the data, and 3 years down the track, you analyse the data, and then you decide, is this good enough to change treatment policy? But in that 3 years, you've had this trial going on for 3 years. And so what that can do is you end up, if one of the treatments is actually better, you end up randomising half of the patients, by definition, to inferior treatments. And that's inefficient for obvious reasons, and it can cost a lot of money as well. So running a trial for 3 years when it only needed to go for 1 year is a bit of a false economy. And yeah, so this was just what I said before. This was motivated by our need, this idea of we didn't want to do simple randomisation. We wanted to adaptively randomise, but we needed to account for these delayed effects of treatment in the SMART, which is hard, but it's possible. So instead of having this randomisation probability in a SMART equal to or proportional to the fraction of the number of treatments under consideration, we can use something it's just a type of Thompson sampling algorithm, or posterior sampling. So here we're saying the probability of receiving treatment A sub k is just the probability that treatment maximises the posterior expected utility. And that is, I think that should be a Q, no. I can't remember what I've done there, but that should be the Q function, sorry. So it maximises, the posterior expected utility. And here we have this little exponent C, which we can either set to 0 if we wanted no adaptive randomisation. It just devolves to the proportionate fractional probability, or we can set that to 1, where we have obviously just this ratio as it stands. There's various different ideas on what that C should be. Some say that it should account for uncertainty early on in the trial, and so there should be a time, the patient number should be incorporated into this exponent. But with the trial we were considering, the C-SMART trial, we didn't think it mattered too much. So there's a myopic approach to doing an adaptive trial with this sort of SMART design. And I'm just describing it here to differentiate it from the dynamic approach, where these utility functions would be as they were described earlier, with the full backward induction step. So in the myopic approach, we have the utility function for the second stage death outcome. That remains the same as before, but the utility function for the first stage prophylaxis outcome, we no longer are bringing that expected utility from the second stage back into the first stage. So hence myopic, it's short-sighted. It only considers the effect of treatment in that stage only. And what we wanted to know was what we know just from the theory that this decision-theoretic approach can work, but how does it work in a real setting, and what do we gain, or what do we gain from taking the dynamic approach compared to the myopic approach? So we did this simulation study. It's a little bit, there's a lot there, but I'll go through it. So what we have here is, this is the ratio of the mean utilities for patients who were on an adaptive trial compared to on a fixed trial. So being on a fixed trial, all patients will have the same utility, expected utility at the start of the trial. On the left, we have our adaptive trial was myopic. We're assuming our adaptive trial was myopic. And on the right, we're assuming our adaptive trial was dynamic. And so each of these squares, we've got 64 squares, and each of those squares, these are obviously level plots. Each of these larger macroscopic sort of squares is a different pairing of depth in each of the second stage sort of decision nodes. So the top right is representative of the death rate being 95% in each after either prophylaxis or placebo. The smaller, within each square, there's, I think it's around 1,000 individual pairings of infection rates in the first stage. So what I really wanted to do with this simulation study is look at all possible scenarios across all possible stages. And I think the main takeaway here is that you can see that where you have an infection rate that initially, the stage 1 infection rate, or the stage 1, where the stage 1 infection rate is relatively lower, but then followed by a relatively higher death rate, you can get this really nasty decrease in utility relative to a fixed trial design. And that can go down as far as a 30% decrease for the trial participants. So here we used we assumed that there was 2,000 participants in the trial, and we made adaptations to the trial. So we changed the way that people were randomised 4 times over the course of the trial. That's only with the myopic adaptive design. When we switch to a dynamic adaptive design, that problem disappears. And in fact, we either have equal utility to a fixed design or substantially better utility, up to around 30% better utility. So that's the utility of the trial participants. What is the utility of the patients that go on to be treated based on a policy derived from the trial results? So it's exactly the same sort of graph schema. We're just looking at a different measure here. So this is the ratio of the utility of the policy that gets chosen. So the experiment gets run, the results are published, and all hospitals go and adopt this strategy that the trial is proposing. How much worse is the utility of the next patient compared to what is known to be optimal? So in the myopic setting, we can see similar sort of pattern here to when we were just focused on the trial participants. Obviously, the trial participants here, there's a lot of them were treated under a fixed design scheme up until we make the first adaptation. So there's actually not a big chance of this sort of reduction in utility is diluted by the fact that we don't start changing the design until we're about halfway through. Then when we go on to make decisions based on the results of the trial, you can see this ratio is from 0 to 1. In some circumstances, if we make that wrong decision, if we have a myopic trial and it gets stuck for whatever reason in the suboptimal regimen, you can end up with huge reductions in utility. And so if you multiply this reduction in utility out to the size of the population that's exposed to this disease, it can be a really bad thing to base decisions on a myopic design. And we don't get that same reduction in the dynamic setting. There's just a few artifacts, I guess, where there's not a lot of effect. So yeah, it's the summary I sort of made, that this method improves our dynamic method can improve the utility of not only patients, but also of any future trial participants, but any future patients. What's interesting is this sort of myopic approach is actually used in the field, so to speak, on some actual smart designs. But I think even more interestingly is that a lot of decisions about sequential treatments, so in cancer, for example, you'll often be treated with one treatment first, a first-line treatment, and if that fails, you'll be treated with a second-line one and then with a third-line one. And none of those treatment policies are based on smart designs or dynamic treatment regimens. They're just sort of cobbled together from results of single-stage trials. And so I think what this shows, and the previous shows, is that that's a bad idea, because you can end up having sticking patients on things that initially look really promising, but ultimately are really bad. So that brings me to the end. Thanks for listening to everything. The final points in summary are just that I've shown here that there's a relatively simple decision-theoretic approach to allow this Q-learning or dynamic programming to proceed with intermediate binary endpoints. I think this idea that decision-theoretic approaches can't be used because you can't decide on utility functions is a little bit misguided, because you can use fairly trivial utility functions to good effect. And that, like I said, the dynamic treatment decisions that get based on stacking single-stage trials could be really terrible. So yeah, thanks for listening.
That's great. Thanks very much, Rob. So I'll open up to questions, maybe in the room first before we go online. So any questions from here? Katie?
Do you mind explaining what the diagonal meant? For instance, in the top left, the diagonal pattern.
In here?
Yeah, just can you break down what it really means?
So the diagonal, I guess there's two diagonals here. The first is the diagonal in terms of you have these 64 squares and you have a diagonal from top right to bottom left. And that's where there's this sort of null death rate. So it doesn't really matter what you do in the second stage, the outcome's the same. So when there's a big difference in infection rate in the initial stage, it doesn't matter so much.
Okay, so for instance, take the top left because that's a really interesting pattern.
Yeah.
So it's 0 to 100% like chance of infection at stage 1. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I actually need to swap these around because I realized putting this together that this would be much more easily interpreted if I put death, the prophylaxis death on the top and the placebo death on the right. But the diagonal, I mean, the diagonal in the individual squares, that's where infection rates are the same in the first stage. So it's an interesting thing that even there's a small difference in infection rates in the first stage, and that difference is so you might have a lower infection rate in the first stage. So here, this is represented by the lower diagonal there. But a much higher death rate following that lower infection rate, then you end up with a reduction in utility.
It's one of those ones I have to stare at, I think.
Yeah, it was the reason I present like this is because it's really hard to try and divine exactly what is happening when you just choose 5 or 6 simulation scenarios, or it was to me anyway. And so this was the only sort of, I guess, feasible way I could try and show all of the different interacting rates of infection and death and their impact on utility. It is a complicated one though, I'll admit.
Thanks, Katie. Was there a question at the front here?
Can you explain the color scale, why of the utility? Why does it start at 0.7 and end at 1.3?
That's just the range of what's observed in the simulation. So we don't see a reduction below 30%, and we don't see an improvement above 30% in terms of utility.
So the utility, sorry, the utility cannot reach 0 at all.
Here, no.
Okay.
No. No, they'll still have. I mean, the utility is still non-zero. Expected utility is still non-zero for all scenarios, I think.
Okay, so I have it again. Is the winning drug then the one that's most assigned when you kind of like adaptively change these probabilities so as to overall maximize people alive?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you then extrapolate in a fair way, probabilistically, that like 5% of, say like 5% of more people are alive using this drug than to a whole population, and say like, actually, because you have that binary outcome, this person, I don't know, this number of people in the trial lived, therefore hundreds of thousands, like is that a fair thing we can do using these utilities in this trial?
Yeah, well, I think that's the aim of most trials, is to come up with a generalizable result. With some sort of health economic assessments, they do exactly that. They take the result and then they extrapolate that to the population under consideration, and then bring in all of the costs and quality of life years gained and the costs, the willingness to pay for that and all that. But here I've just kept it simple by considering what the next patient's expected utility would be if they were treated under this treatment policy.
Thank you. Any questions from online? just a quick question for me. So was that the actual utility you used to design the trial?
No, the trial was designed just based on the first stage outcome.
Right.
So we didn't use, well, we used, I guess we did use 0 and 1 utilities then. So, yeah.
Okay.
But we didn't go so far into it as to try and come up with the, you know, the dynamic adaptive algorithm. We just looked at the operating characteristics in the first stage only.
Right. And then extending to more than 2 stages, is it in principle straightforward? It just becomes computationally difficult, infeasible, perhaps?
Yeah, yeah. So you can go beyond 2 treatments or 2 stages. Like anything is possible, but it just becomes completely intractable, particularly in terms of methodological development. Even, you know, notationally, even 2 stages becomes really cumbersome. And then there's some who think that if you do go beyond these 2 stages, then you can start to drop this non-Markovian assumption. So you can start to think, okay, we've got 4 stages, so we should only consider history from the previous 2 stages. But I think what this shows is that's quite a, that can result in some really, that can have some nasty consequences.
Okay, any other questions from online or in the room? All right, if not, let's thank Rob again.
Thanks for listening.